Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax.
On a stormy night, Lydia moved into an old Victorian house she inherited from a distant relative. The house creaked and groaned with every step, and beneath the floorboards, faint whispers seemed to drift upward. At first, she dismissed them as wind seeping through cracks, but the whispers grew more distinct, uttering her name in chilling tones. Desperate to uncover the source, she pried open the floorboards, revealing a journal wrapped in brittle leather. The entries detailed the life of a young woman trapped in the house over a century ago, tormented by unseen entities. As Lydia read aloud, the whispers coalesced into screams, and the shadows in the room began to writhe. She realized too late that she had awakened something long buried. The rain outside seemed to intensify, a soothing rhythm masking the unease of what lingered in the air. Evan loved hiking alone, finding solace in nature's quiet embrace. But one particular trail, lined with ancient oaks and thick fog, held a sinister presence. On this trail, Evan always felt eyes on him. One evening, he camped by a clearing, and as he lay in his tent, he heard footsteps circling. He peeked outside and saw nothing but swaying branches. In the morning, strange symbols were etched into the dirt around his tent. Each night, the presence grew bolder, until one night he awoke to find a figure standing just beyond the campfire's glow, its eyes reflecting an unnatural light. He fled, but the watcher's shadow loomed on the trees, following him home. Even now, Evan refuses to look outside at night, fearing he'll see it waiting. Thunder rumbled in the distance, mingling with the gentle patter of rain, as if nature itself held secrets too dark to reveal. Karen worked late shifts at the hospital and often drove home in the dead of night. One evening, as she pulled onto a desolate highway, she noticed a woman standing at the roadside, drenched and shivering. Feeling a pang of sympathy, Karen stopped to offer a ride. The woman climbed in silently, her face obscured by wet hair. No matter how much Karen tried to make conversation, the woman remained silent, pointing only forward. When Karen finally glanced at her closely, the seat was empty, though the passenger door had never opened. She arrived home to find a soaking wet scarf draped over her passenger seat. The next day, she learned of a woman who'd vanished on that very road years ago. The rain softened to a gentle drizzle, a calming rhythm that belied the unsettling tale just told. At an antique shop in a quiet town, Marcus found a beautifully ornate clock that stopped ticking exactly at 3:33 a.m. every night. When he brought it home, strange occurrences began. Objects moved slightly out of place, and faint whispers filled his home at night. One evening, as the clock struck 3:33, it chimed loudly, though it wasn't wound. A shadowy figure appeared in the corner of the room, its hand outstretched toward Marcus. Desperate, he smashed the clock, and the figure vanished. But every night since, Marcus wakes at 3:33 a.m., the shadow now appearing closer than before. The rain outside mingled with a faint tapping, like the sound of a distant clock counting down. In a small village, there was a well said to be cursed. Children claimed they could hear voices calling from its depths, pleading for help. One summer, a boy named Jacob dared to look into the well. He heard a soft voice begging him to lower the bucket. As he cranked the handle, a sense of dread crept over him. The bucket came up, heavy and dripping, but instead of water, it held a bundle wrapped in tattered cloth. The bundle shifted, and a hand reached out. Jacob fled, but the voice from the well followed him in his dreams, growing louder each night. The villager said the well never stayed silent for long. The steady drip of water echoed faintly, like the remnants of a forgotten plea. In a quiet apartment building, Claire began noticing shadows on her walls that didn't match her furniture or movements. At first, she chalked it up to poor lighting, but the shadows became more defined, taking the shape of a person standing still. One night, as she lay in bed, the shadow moved toward her, its shape morphing into a featureless figure. Paralyzed with fear, Claire could only watch as the shadow loomed over her. When she screamed, it vanished. The next day, she discovered that her apartment's previous tenant had mysteriously disappeared. Now, the shadows seemed to wait for her to fall asleep. The rain outside faded into a soft mist, the world outside growing eerily silent. Late one night, Alex received a phone call from his best friend, who'd been missing for weeks. The connection was poor, filled with static, but Alex could hear his friend's voice pleading for help. The call ended abruptly, and when Alex tried to call back, the number was disconnected. Determined to find his friend, Alex followed the faint clues in the call, leading him to an abandoned building. Inside, he found his friend's phone lying on a table, still warm as if recently used. As Alex turned to leave, his own phone rang. It was his friend's voice again, whispering, "Don't turn around." The patter of rain became a steady rhythm again, a soothing but deceptive melody hiding the unease. On a foggy evening, a small fishing village braced itself against the chill of the sea. Every full moon, a mysterious bell could be heard ringing across the waves, though no ship was ever seen. Marta, a local innkeeper, decided to investigate after losing her brother to the sea many years ago. She borrowed a small boat and rowed toward the sound. As she neared the source, an ancient shipwreck rose from the water, its bell tolling mournfully. Skeletal figures emerged on deck, beckoning her closer. Marta's screams were swallowed by the waves, and the bell continued its haunting chime, waiting for its next victim. The rain began to fall more heavily, masking the eerie tolling that seemed to linger in the distance. Years ago, a traveling carnival visited a remote town, leaving behind an abandoned carousel in the woods. The townsfolk whispered that it was cursed, for every child who tried to play on it vanished without a trace. Years later, a curious teenager named Lily decided to see if the rumors were true. She found the carousel, its paint peeling and horses frozen in menacing snarls. When she placed a hand on one of the horses, the carousel began to turn on its own. The music played in reverse, and the horse's eyes glowed. Lily tried to run, but she was pulled onto the carousel, her screams joining the haunting melody. The next morning, only her shoe was found, lying in the dew-covered grass. The rain continued to patter against the ground, a rhythmic accompaniment to the sorrowful tales of loss. In the heart of a desolate desert, there lay a town that appeared on no map. Jack, a weary traveler, stumbled upon it after losing his way. The town was eerily pristine, with empty streets and windows that reflected too clearly. As he wandered, he felt unseen eyes following him. He entered the town's diner, where a plate of steaming food sat untouched on the counter. When he reached for it, the mirror behind the counter showed his reflection grinning back, though Jack had not smiled. The doors slammed shut, and the diner grew colder. To this day, travelers speak of a town where the only residents are reflections that move on their own. Thunder cracked in the distance, the storm outside seemingly growing in intensity. Mira moved into an old farmhouse to escape the chaos of the city, charmed by its rustic beauty. But from the first night she heard scratching at the windows, though no trees were nearby. She dismissed it as wildlife, but each night the scratching grew louder, accompanied by faint giggles. One evening, Mira placed flour around the house to catch footprints. By morning, tiny clawed tracks circled her bed, leading to the attic. Armed with a flashlight, she climbed the creaking stairs, only to find the attic empty save for a single dusty doll. Its painted smile seemed wider than before, and its tiny hands were smeared with flour. The rain outside eased into a steady drizzle, a deceptive calm after the chilling discovery. There's a patch of woods behind my grandmother's house. As a child, I was always told to stay away from it. It's dangerous, my grandmother would warn, her voice low and serious. People get lost in there, and sometimes they don't come back. One summer, curiosity got the better of me. I snuck out during the golden hour when the light filtered through the trees like liquid gold. I didn't plan to go far, just enough to satisfy my curiosity. But as soon as I stepped into the woods, the atmosphere changed. The air grew heavy and the world seemed to quiet, as though I had walked into another realm. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Help me. My heart raced. I turned in circles, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Help me, please. I ran as fast as I could, the whispers chasing me until I burst out of the woods and into the safety of my grandmother's yard. I never told her what happened, but I've never gone near those woods again. The flyer was old, yellowed at the edges, but the bold letters still stood out. The Carnival of Wonders, one night only. My friends and I found it taped to a lamppost in the middle of nowhere, and we couldn't resist. When we arrived, the carnival was buzzing with life, rides spinning, lights flashing, and music echoing through the air. But something felt off. The workers didn't look quite right, their smiles a little too wide, their movements a little too stiff. I wandered into the fortune teller's tent. The old woman inside looked up at me with piercing eyes. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. Before I could respond, the ground beneath me shifted. The vibrant carnival faded, replaced by an abandoned lot overgrown with weeds. My friends and I stumbled out, shaken and confused. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I've never looked at a carnival the same way again. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. The hotel was quaint, tucked away in the mountains, and perfect for a peaceful escape. But from the moment we checked in, something felt off. The receptionist handed us the key to room 217. "It's one of our best," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. That night I woke up to a strange sound, a soft humming, like a lullaby. I got out of bed and opened the door to the hallway. That's when I saw it. The room across from ours was glowing faintly, its door slightly ajar. I stepped inside and found a beautifully decorated nursery, complete with a crib and rocking chair. A soft melody played from a music box. When I told the receptionist about it the next morning, she looked at me in confusion. "Room 217 is the last room on that floor," she said. "There's no room across from it." It was late, and I was working on a report in my home office. The street outside was quiet, and the only light came from my desk lamp. That's when I noticed him, a man standing on the sidewalk, staring up at my window. At first, I thought he was just passing by, but he didn't move. He just stood there, his face shadowed, watching. I tried to focus on my work, but every time I glanced out the window, he was still there. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I closed my laptop and pulled the curtains shut. The next morning, I decided to check my security camera footage. What I saw made my blood run cold. The man wasn't standing outside. He was inside the house, standing just behind me, staring at the back of my head. I was driving home late one night, the road deserted except for my car. That's when I saw her. A young woman standing by the side of the road, her thumb out. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. She climbed in silently, her face pale and her hands trembling. I tried to make small talk, but she only gave short, vague answers. When we reached the address she'd given me, I turned to say goodbye, but she was gone. The passenger seat was empty. I got out of the car and approached the house. An elderly woman answered the door. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I just dropped off a young woman," I said. "She told me she lives here." The woman's face softened and she gave me a sad smile. "That must have been my daughter," she said. "She passed away 10 years ago, but people still see her on that road." In a small, sleepy town, an old railway station stood abandoned for decades. The locals claimed to hear the faint sound of a train whistle late at night, even though the tracks had been removed long ago. Greg, a history enthusiast, decided to explore the station to uncover its secrets. Armed with a flashlight, he entered the crumbling building and found it eerily preserved, as if frozen in time. When the clock struck midnight, he heard the unmistakable sound of a train pulling in. Looking out the shattered windows, Greg saw a spectral locomotive, passengers with hollow eyes boarding silently. When he turned back to leave, he found himself standing on a platform in the 1920s, surrounded by the ghosts of the past. The station vanished the next morning, and Greg was never seen again. The rain outside turned to a torrential downpour, drowning the world in a relentless rhythm of drops and whispers. Amelia loved her weekly visits to the library, where she often wandered into the rarely used basement archives. One evening, as she browsed through dusty old tomes, she found a book bound in dark leather with no title. The pages were blank, but as she flipped through them, faint handwriting began to appear, recounting moments from her own life. As the words continued to write themselves, they began to describe her exact actions in the basement. Panicking, Amelia tried to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. The book's final entry read, "She never left the library." When the librarian arrived the next morning, the book was on the desk, its last page showing a drawing of Amelia staring out in terror. The steady rhythm of rain outside seemed to echo the tapping of unseen fingers on a desk. Deep in the countryside, a lonely lighthouse stood on a cliff, its light long extinguished. Fishermen whispered of strange occurrences at the lighthouse, where they claimed to see the light flicker on during the heaviest storms. Sophie, a photographer, ventured to capture the eerie beauty of the structure. As she approached, the light blazed to life, illuminating the churning sea. Inside, Sophie found a logbook describing sailors who had died at sea, each entry ending with the same phrase. The lighthouse called them home. As she flipped through the pages, the door slammed shut and the light turned red. Sophie's camera was later found at the base of the cliff, but she was gone, her last photo showing the lighthouse glowing in the storm. The rain outside seemed to swirl with the wind, a haunting lullaby of nature's fury. A dense forest near a remote cabin was rumored to be haunted by the echoed ones. Campers spoke of hearing their own voices calling to them from the shadows, mimicking their every word in distorted tones. When Jason and Mia stayed at the cabin for a weekend getaway, they laughed off the stories. But on their second night, they heard their own laughter echoing from the forest, growing louder and more disjointed. Jason ventured outside only for Mia to hear his voice calling back, saying things he never said. She locked the door, but when Jason returned, his eyes were vacant and his voice sounded hollow. The real Jason was never found, and the forest remains a place of unspeakable horrors. The storm outside roared, as if the elements themselves sought to drown out the echoes of the forest. On the edge of an old coastal town, a lighthouse keeper named Harold lived in isolation. Every evening he lit the beacon to guide ships safely through treacherous waters. One stormy night he heard faint knocks on his door. When he opened it, there was no one there, only the roaring wind and crashing waves. But the knocks returned, louder and more insistent. Finally, he opened the door again and found a soaked letter on the step. Inside was a single word: help. That night, Harold saw a shipwrecked vessel in the distance, its mast illuminated by lightning. As he tried to signal with his light, the shadowy figures of drowned sailors began appearing around the lighthouse, their eyes fixed on him. Each knock at the door became louder until it seemed to come from all around him. By morning, the storm had passed, but Harold was never seen again. Only his journal remained, describing the haunting night and ending abruptly with, "They're here." The rain outside softened, tapping rhythmically against the windows, as if echoing the unanswered knocks. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a small village had long been abandoned. Locals whispered of a curse that befell its residents after they unearthed an ancient artifact in the woods. Amelia, a treasure hunter, dismissed the stories as folklore and set out to explore the area. In the forest, she found an overgrown path leading to a crumbling stone altar. There, she discovered a silver pendant etched with strange runes. As she picked it up, the forest grew eerily silent. That night, back in her tent, she awoke to the sound of footsteps circling her campsite. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the air grew colder with each passing moment. When she looked at the pendant, the runes glowed faintly, and whispers filled the air, promising knowledge and power. But Amelia realized too late that the whispers weren't coming from the pendant. They were all around her, closing in. The wind howled through the trees, blending with the soft patter of rain, as if nature itself mourned the loss of another soul. In a suburban neighborhood, a peculiar ice cream truck would appear every summer evening, its tinny music drifting through the streets. The truck's driver was never seen, and the children who bought ice cream from it often became sick, experiencing strange nightmares of endless corridors and unseen pursuers. Mia, a teenager who babysat for her neighbors, noticed the truck lingering outside longer than usual one evening. Curious, she approached it, finding the windows covered in condensation. When she peered inside, the interior seemed impossibly vast, filled with shadows that writhed and whispered. A voice invited her to step in, offering her any flavor she desired. She fled, but later that night she heard the truck's music outside her own window. The next day, the ice cream truck vanished, but Mia could still hear its haunting melody whenever she closed her eyes. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, a subtle warning amidst the otherwise calming rain. On a remote island, a research team was studying an ancient burial ground, rumored to belong to a lost civilization. One night, Dr. Hayes, the team leader, found a stone tablet inscribed with glyphs that seemed to shift under her gaze. As she translated the symbols, a strange fog rolled in, and the air became heavy with the scent of decay. Members of the team began hearing their names whispered on the wind, accompanied by distant footsteps that left no prints. One by one, they disappeared, leaving behind only their equipment and faint traces of ash. Dr. Hayes's final log entry, found days later, read, "The dead don't rest here, they're watching." The rain outside turned to a gentle mist, shrouding the island in an otherworldly stillness. A pianist named Victor inherited an old grand piano from his late grandmother. The instrument had a peculiar quirk. It played faint melodies on its own late at night. At first, Victor thought it was the wind or a mechanical issue, but the songs grew more elaborate, weaving hauntingly beautiful tunes. One night, as he played, the keys began moving under his fingers as if guided by an unseen force. The melody shifted to something dark and sorrowful, and Victor's hands froze as he felt a cold presence behind him. In the mirror across the room, he saw the faint reflection of his grandmother, her face twisted in anguish. She whispered, "Don't play the last note," but his fingers moved against his will, striking the final chord. The piano fell silent and Victor's reflection vanished. From that night on, the piano remained cold to the touch, its keys forever still. The rain outside swelled to a crescendo, masking the eerie silence that followed Victor's final performance. The rain tapped gently against the windows of the old cabin as Mia unpacked her belongings for the weekend retreat. It was meant to be a peaceful escape, but something about the cabin felt wrong. The air was heavy, the silence too absolute. As she settled in, she noticed the old rocking chair in the corner. It swayed ever so slightly, though there was no breeze. That night, the creaking of the chair grew louder, and she swore she saw a shadow sitting in it. The next morning, Mia found a message carved into the armrest. "Don't leave me alone." The rain outside seemed to echo the rhythmic creak of the rocking chair, an unsettling harmony. In the heart of the city stood a towering skyscraper, but its 13th floor had been sealed off for years. Victor, a security guard, was dared by his colleagues to explore it one stormy night. Armed with a flashlight, he pried open the door to the forbidden floor. The air inside was frigid, and the walls were covered in strange, childlike drawings. As he ventured deeper, he heard faint giggles and the sound of running feet. His flashlight flickered, revealing tiny handprints on the walls, growing closer with each flash. Victor ran, but the elevator refused to open. Behind him, the laughter turned into screams. By the time the elevator door opened, Victor was gone. Thunder rumbled outside, masking the faint echoes of laughter from somewhere deep within the building. Leela loved collecting vintage mirrors. Her latest find was a gilded antique with an intricate frame. It was beautiful, but the reflection seemed off. Late one night, as she walked past it, she saw her reflection lingering a moment too long. It smiled when she didn't. Startled, she covered the mirror with a sheet. The next morning, the sheet was on the floor, and her reflection appeared exhausted, with dark circles under its eyes. She tried to get rid of the mirror, but every time she left the house, it reappeared on her wall. The final straw came when she looked into the mirror and saw her reflection mouthing two words: "Let me." The gentle patter of rain outside failed to drown out the growing dread in Lila's home. On a remote hiking trail, Peter found an old camera buried in the dirt. Curious, he developed the film, revealing blurry images of people, their faces twisted in expressions of fear. One photo showed the exact spot where he had found the camera, but in the background there was a figure standing among the trees, staring directly at him. That night, Peter's phone buzzed with a notification. A photo of him asleep, taken from within his room. The camera was nowhere to be found, but the photos continued to appear. The rain outside began to pour harder, as if urging Peter to stay inside, away from prying eyes. Ava moved into her grandmother's old house after inheriting it. The attic had always been locked, but the key was now hers. When she opened it, she found a child's bedroom frozen in time, complete with toys and a small bed. A diary lay on the nightstand, detailing the imaginary friend of a child named Rosie. As Ava read, she felt the air grow colder, and faint whispers seemed to echo her name. That night, the sound of giggling woke her. On the wall, written in crayon, were the words, "Play with me, Ava." The attic door creaked, its sound mingling with the soft tapping of rain on the roof. In a quiet coastal town, an abandoned lighthouse stood as a grim reminder of the past. Locals said the keeper had vanished decades ago, leaving the light burning for weeks. One evening, a storm rolled in, and the lighthouse's beacon lit up for the first time in years. Elena, a photographer, went to capture the eerie sight. Inside, she found the air thick with salt and the faint smell of burning oil. Climbing the spiral stairs, she heard footsteps above her. When she reached the top, the light went out, plunging her into darkness. A voice whispered, "I never left." The waves crashed against the rocks, blending with the soft drizzle of rain, an ominous lullaby. In the countryside, a farmer discovered an old scarecrow on his property, though he'd never placed one there. Its head was a burlap sack, its eyes crude buttons sewn on with care. The farmer's crops flourished, but every morning the scarecrow seemed to have moved slightly, its head tilted toward the house. One night, unable to sleep, he watched from his window as the scarecrow's shadow stretched across the field, growing closer. By morning, the scarecrow stood at his doorstep, holding a bundle of fresh corn. The farmer moved away, but every harvest season the scarecrow appeared in his new fields, watching. The soft rustle of leaves and rain whispered secrets. Only the scarecrow seemed to understand. On a long stretch of highway, drivers often reported seeing a hitchhiker in a faded yellow raincoat. When they stopped to offer a ride, the figure would disappear. One stormy night, Sarah picked up the hitchhiker, her curiosity outweighing her fear. The man sat silently in the passenger seat, water pooling at his feet. When Sarah asked where he was headed, he pointed to a sign that read, "Dead End." The car's radio crackled, and the man turned to face her. His face was a hollow void. Sarah swerved, crashing into a ditch. When she woke, the raincoat lay on the passenger seat, soaked but empty. The rain intensified, a rhythmic cadence against the windshield, as if to drown out the terror of the night. An old clockmaker's shop stood untouched for decades, its windows covered in grime. Emily, an antique enthusiast, entered one rainy afternoon, drawn by the sound of ticking. Inside, the clocks all worked perfectly, their hands synchronized to the second. The clockmaker, an elderly man, appeared from the shadows, offering her a beautiful pocket watch. He warned her never to open it. Ignoring his advice, Emily pried it open that night. The ticking stopped, and with it, time itself seemed to freeze. Shadows crept across the room, and the clockmaker's voice echoed in her mind. "You can't stop them now." The rain outside seemed frozen in midair, droplets suspended in an unnatural stillness. At a secluded boarding school, students whispered about a ghost that roamed the library at night. One evening, Liam stayed late, determined to find the truth. The library was silent except for the sound of pages turning, though no one was there. Books began to fall from the shelves, forming a trail leading to a hidden door. Inside, Liam found an old desk covered in letters addressed to someone named Eleanor. As he read one, a pale figure appeared, her eyes filled with sorrow. She whispered, "Return what was taken," before vanishing. The next morning, the letters were gone, but Liam could still hear her voice in the quiet moments of the day. The rain outside turned to a soft drizzle, its calming rhythm belying the unease that lingered in the air. On a misty evening, a woman named Claire moved into an old countryside manor she had inherited. The house's grand halls echoed with every step, but it was the locked room at the end of the corridor that intrigued her. Inside, she found an ancient wardrobe covered in dust. That night, she heard the creak of its doors opening. When she checked, it was empty. Yet each morning, muddy footprints led from the wardrobe to her bed. On the seventh day, she awoke to find the wardrobe doors wide open, and a single sentence scrawled on the mirror. "I'm home." Outside, the rain fell steadily, the rhythmic sound mingling with her growing fear. In a small, forgotten village, there was a legend of a midnight market that appeared only during a full moon. Amelia, curious about the stories, ventured into the woods one moonlit night and stumbled upon it. The market glowed with lantern light, and merchants sold bizarre items: bottled shadows, jars of whispers, and clocks that ticked backward. One vendor offered her a mirror that promised to reveal her future. When she looked into it, she saw herself running through the woods, chased by shadowy figures. The vendor smiled and said, "It's closer than you think." By the time she turned, the market was gone, and the shadows had found her. The forest rustled with the sound of leaves and distant thunder, as if nature conspired to hide her fate. Lucas was driving home on a rainy night when he noticed a pale figure standing at the side of the road. Feeling uneasy, he kept driving, but a few miles later the figure reappeared, closer this time. When he glanced in his rearview mirror, the figure was now sitting in his back seat, its hollow eyes staring at him. The car's radio began to crackle, and a faint voice whispered, "You can't leave me behind." Panicked, Lucas veered off the road. When he looked back, the seat was empty, but the whispering didn't stop. Rain pattered against the windshield, masking the unsettling voice that lingered in the car. In a quiet town, children told stories of the Whispering Well. If you leaned in close, it would reveal secrets, but at a cost. Julia, skeptical but intrigued, approached the well one evening. She whispered her question, and the well answered with her deepest desire. But that night her dreams were filled with whispers that grew louder and more insistent. By morning her voice was gone, replaced by the well's haunting whispers, which now echoed wherever she went. The rain outside fell in soft drips, mimicking the steady cadence of the well's secrets. An old hotel on the outskirts of town had been abandoned for years, yet its lights would flicker on during heavy storms. Peter, a journalist, decided to investigate. Inside, the lobby was pristine, as if it had been frozen in time. As he explored, he noticed a ledger on the front desk, open to a page listing his name as the newest guest. When he tried to leave, the doors wouldn't budge. The elevator dinged, and the doors opened to reveal an empty cabin. Against his better judgment, he stepped in. The elevator descended, far below the building's floors, stopping in a dark, endless hallway. A voice over the intercom whispered, "Welcome home." The storm outside raged, thunder shaking the building as if trying to warn him. Maggie had always been drawn to thrift stores, finding beauty in discarded objects. One day, she bought an old music box with a hauntingly beautiful tune. That night, the box began playing on its own. Its melody was mesmerizing, but Maggie noticed that each time it played, the shadows in her room shifted, growing darker and more defined. One night, the music stopped abruptly, and the room was plunged into silence. A voice from the shadows whispered, "Dance with us." The rain tapped lightly against her window, an unsettling backdrop to the silence that followed. A small town had an unusual tradition. Every year during the autumn festival, the townspeople would leave a single empty chair at the banquet. No one would explain why. When Lucy, a newcomer, asked about it, she was met with uneasy smiles and silence. That night, she snuck back to the banquet hall after the festival. The chair was still there, but now it was occupied by a figure cloaked in shadow. It turned to face her, its hollow eyes gleaming, and whispered, "You weren't invited." The next morning, Lucy was gone, and the town carried on as if she'd never existed. The sound of falling leaves mingled with the soft drizzle of rain, a mournful symphony for the missing. Theo loved visiting the library's archives, a maze of shelves filled with forgotten books. One evening, he found a book with no title. Its pages were blank, but as he flipped through, words began to appear, describing his every action in real time. The final page read, "He never left." The lights in the library flickered, and when they came back on, Theo was nowhere to be found. The book, now titled The Last Visitor, sat neatly on the shelf. The gentle rain outside seemed to turn the library's windows into mirrors, reflecting the stories of those who had disappeared. A group of friends rented a cabin in the mountains for a weekend getaway. On the first night, they found a set of Polaroid photos tucked under a floorboard. The pictures showed the group, but in each photo, one person was missing. As the weekend progressed, they began to vanish one by one, their belongings left untouched. The last photo showed the cabin empty, except for the camera. When search parties arrived weeks later, they found the Polaroids, now showing the searchers themselves. The wind howled outside, carrying the echoes of laughter that no longer belonged to the living. In a sleepy village, there was a stone bridge said to be cursed. If you crossed it after midnight, you'd hear footsteps following you, though no one would be there. One night, Daniel dared to cross it. Halfway across, the footsteps began, slow and deliberate. He quickened his pace, but the steps matched his. When he reached the end of the bridge, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find nothing but the empty bridge behind him. From then on, he would hear those footsteps every night, no matter where he went. The rain fell steadily, the bridge's stones slick and shining under the dim moonlight, as if holding on to secrets long forgotten. On the outskirts of a desolate town, a lone church stood abandoned. Olivia, an urban explorer, ventured inside to capture its eerie beauty. As she photographed the decaying pews, the organ began playing a haunting melody. She turned to see a shadowy figure seated at the keys. It whispered, "Do you confess?" When Olivia fled, she found her photos distorted, each one showing the shadow closer to her than the last. The rain began to fall lightly, the sound blending with the faint echo of organ notes. During a camping trip, Eric and his friends discovered a strange cave. Inside, they found handprints smeared across the walls, some impossibly high. That night, Eric heard whispers from the direction of the cave, followed by faint footsteps. When he checked, he found a handprint on his tent, still wet. The next morning, the cave was gone, but the whispers never stopped. The patter of rain on the tent seemed to match the rhythm of unseen footsteps. Lana inherited her grandmother's antique doll collection, each with its own name and delicate clothes. One doll, named Clara, seemed to watch her no matter where she moved. One stormy night, Lana woke to find Clara missing from the shelf. She searched the house, only to find Clara sitting at the kitchen table, a tiny knife in her porcelain hand. Scratched into the table were the words, "Your turn." The thunder outside rumbled softly, a sinister counterpoint to the doll's silent presence. A clock tower in a quiet village had stopped working decades ago. One foggy night, Alex heard its chime echo through the streets. Curious, he climbed to the top, finding the clock hands spinning wildly. A journal lay nearby, detailing the deaths of villagers every time the clock struck midnight. As Alex read, the clock struck 12, and he felt cold hands grip his shoulders. The drizzle outside became a steady downpour, muffling the chilling sound of the clock's final chime. In a seaside town, fishermen spoke of the Black Wave, a wave that carried ghostly ships. Emily, a marine biologist, dismissed the stories until one stormy night when she saw a ship emerging from the fog. Its crew, skeletal and drenched, beckoned her closer. As she approached, the ship vanished, but her boat was found days later, empty except for a single soaked journal. The sound of crashing waves merged with the gentle tapping of rain, creating an ominous symphony. A small bookstore carried a mysterious book with no title. Every customer who purchased it claimed to hear scratching noises and distant whispers. When Sarah, the owner, opened it one night, the pages were blank except for one line. "Don't turn around." Ignoring the warning, she turned to see her shadow moving independently, reaching out to her. The rain outside turned into a soft drizzle, the perfect backdrop for the store's haunting silence. In a quiet forest, hikers reported seeing a pale woman in a red dress, always standing still. One evening, Ben spotted her and decided to approach. As he drew closer, she turned to face him, revealing a face with no features. He ran back to his car, but in the rearview mirror, she sat silently in the back seat. The rain intensified, drops pelting the windshield, blurring the reflection of his silent passenger. An old carousel in an abandoned amusement park began turning on its own during a storm. Kayla, a thrill-seeker, decided to investigate. The horse's painted eyes seemed to follow her as she walked past. When she dared to ride, the carousel spun faster and faster. She screamed, but her voice was drowned by carnival music that hadn't played in decades. When the ride stopped, Kayla was gone, leaving only the echo of her laughter. The wind outside carried faint strains of music, merging with the steady rain. A farm on the edge of town was said to be haunted by its previous owner. One night, Jacob, the new owner, found all his livestock gathered in a tight circle, staring at the barn. Inside, he saw the ghostly outline of a man holding a lantern. The figure whispered, "You're on borrowed time." By dawn, the barn had burned to the ground. The rain began to fall in earnest, hissing against the scorched remains of the barn. Ella loved stargazing, but one night she noticed a new constellation shaped like a hand. As she watched, the stars seemed to move, the hand reaching closer. When she looked through her telescope, the hand's fingers stretched toward her, and a whisper in her ear said, "We see you." The drizzle outside became a soothing sound, masking the cosmic dread that filled the air. An abandoned subway station in the city had been sealed off for years. Max, an urban explorer, snuck in, finding graffiti that said, "Keep the trains running." When he ventured onto the tracks, a faint light appeared in the tunnel. A train with shattered windows and empty cars roared past, but the sound of passengers screaming lingered long after it was gone. The steady rhythm of rain mirrored the distant echo of wheels on tracks. In a remote inn, guests complained of hearing soft humming at night. Lily, the innkeeper, traced the sound to the attic, where she found an old gramophone. It began playing on its own, the melody slow and mournful. As she turned to leave, a voice whispered in her ear, "Dance with me." The rain outside seemed to sway with the haunting tune, creating an eerie duet. A fishing village had a legend of mermaids that sang sailors to their doom. During a storm, Ethan heard a melody so beautiful that he followed it to the docks. There, a woman with shimmering scales emerged from the water, her eyes filled with sorrow. As she sang, Ethan felt himself drawn into the waves. The next morning, only his footprints remained. The waves lapped against the shore, blending with the soft patter of rain. In a snow-covered forest, travelers spoke of a cabin that appeared only to those in need. Mark, lost and freezing, stumbled upon it. Inside, a fire burned warmly, and food awaited him. As he ate, he noticed portraits on the walls of people who had stayed there before. Their eyes seemed to follow him, and when he looked closer, one of the portraits was of him. The rain outside turned to sleet, a chilling reminder of the cabin's secrets. When Samantha moved into her new apartment, the landlord warned her about the room at the end of the hall. It was always locked, and he told her it was best left undisturbed. But curiosity gnawed at her, especially when she heard faint whispers coming from behind the door at night. One stormy evening, the lock was mysteriously undone. Samantha opened the door to find a perfectly preserved nursery, untouched by time. The rocking chair in the corner creaked gently as though someone invisible sat there. On the crib's mobile, a single dusty note hung, reading, "Welcome back." That night, Samantha dreamed of a crying child and woke to find tiny handprints on her pillow. The rain outside grew heavier, its rhythmic tapping a haunting backdrop to her discovery. On a rocky coast stood an abandoned lighthouse with a tragic history. Nathan, a historian, was determined to uncover its secrets. He found the keeper's journal buried under rubble, its pages detailing a descent into madness. The entries spoke of ghostly sailors who came ashore during storms, their hollow eyes demanding the keeper's light to guide them. One stormy night, Nathan stayed in the lighthouse to verify the tale. As the wind howled, he saw spectral figures climbing the rocks below. The beacon lit itself, casting an eerie glow over the sea. By dawn, Nathan's journal was found near the lighthouse, his final entry reading, "They needed the light. Now, they need me." The crashing waves and rain outside seemed to mourn the lighthouse's latest victim. Deep in the mountains, travelers whispered of an inn that appeared during storms, offering refuge to the lost. Clara, caught in a sudden downpour, stumbled upon the silent inn. The innkeeper, pale and polite, ushered her in and offered her a warm meal. The other guests stared silently at their plates, never speaking. When Clara tried to ask about them, the innkeeper simply said, "They're resting." That night, Clara awoke to find the guests standing around her bed, their faces blank and their eyes unblinking. The next morning, she was gone, and the innkeeper welcomed a new traveler. The rain outside fell steadily, a soft melody to the inn's eerie stillness. At the edge of a quiet village lay a dense forest. Locals warned of the Watchers, figures seen only in the corner of one's eye. Rachel, a skeptic, ventured into the woods to debunk the legend. As twilight fell, she felt the weight of unseen eyes. Shadows moved between the trees, and whispers surrounded her. She turned to leave, but found the path had disappeared. A figure stepped into view, its face obscured by darkness. "We've been watching you," it rasped. Days later, villagers found Rachel's journal at the forest's edge, filled with entries she hadn't written. The rustling leaves and soft rain added to the forest's haunting symphony. In a sprawling manor, a hidden corridor was said to appear only at night. Daniel, an architect, was hired to restore the mansion, but became obsessed with finding the corridor. One night, he discovered a door that led to a long hallway. The deeper he ventured, the longer it stretched. Portraits on the walls changed as he passed, their eyes following him. When he tried to turn back, the door had vanished. Hours later, workers found Daniel's tools at the entrance, but he was never seen again. The corridor remained locked, its secret safe. The patter of rain on the windows seemed to echo Daniel's footsteps in the endless hall. A traveling fairground appeared on the outskirts of town every decade, bringing with it tales of missing children. Emma, a journalist, visited to uncover the truth. The fair was alive with lights and music, but something felt off. The workers moved unnaturally, their smiles too wide. When Emma followed a child into the Hall of Mirrors, she saw reflections of herself, each more distorted. One reflection spoke, "Stay with us." The next morning, the fairground was gone, and Emma's name was etched into a tree alongside dozens of others. The faint sound of a carousel blended with the rain, as if the fairground still lingered. In a small town, an eccentric clockmaker was rumored to create timepieces that could stop time. Marcus, curious about the legend, bought one of the clocks. That night, the clock struck 3:33 a.m., and the world around him froze. Shadows moved independently, figures forming out of the stillness. A voice whispered, "Time belongs to us now." When the clock resumed, Marcus was gone, leaving only the clock, its hands spinning wildly. The ticking of the clock merged with the gentle rhythm of rain, marking time's eerie dominion. In her attic, Elise discovered an old portrait of a woman who resembled her. The painting's eyes seemed alive, following her movements. At night, Elise heard faint whispers, and the woman in the portrait began to change, her expression growing more sinister. One stormy night, Elise awoke to find the portrait empty, the woman standing at the foot of her bed. "Thank you for freeing me," she whispered before vanishing. The next day, Elise's reflection in the mirror was not her own. The rain outside turned to a soft drizzle, its calming sound a stark contrast to Elise's dread. At an estate sale, Liam bought an antique violin said to have belonged to a famous composer. When he played it, the melody was hauntingly beautiful, but the room grew colder with each note. Shadows danced along the walls, and faint applause echoed around him. That night, the violin played on its own, and Liam's dreams were filled with the composer's voice, demanding, "Play for them." By morning, the violin lay shattered, and Liam was gone. The sound of rain against the window added a mournful note to the violin's final performance. A serene lake in the heart of the forest was said to be cursed. James, a nature photographer, ignored the warnings and set up camp near the shore. At night, he heard splashing and saw ripples spreading across the water. In his photos, he noticed a shadow beneath the surface, growing larger with each shot. On the third night, he awoke to find wet footprints leading from the lake to his tent. The last photo on his camera showed James standing at the water's edge, though he had no memory of taking it. The rain began to fall gently, blending with the soft lapping of the water against the shore. In a small town, an old library opened only at midnight. Desperate to find a rare book, Carla entered despite the strange timing. Inside, the shelves stretched infinitely, and the books whispered as she passed. She found the book she needed, but when she opened it, the pages described her every action. The final line read, "She never left." When the clock struck 1, the library vanished, leaving Carla trapped in the endless shelves. The drizzle outside became a steady rain, each drop marking the passage of an hour that no longer belonged to Carla. At a roadside inn, travelers often avoided room 12, claiming the mirror inside reflected things that weren't there. Jacob, a skeptic, booked the room to debunk the tales. That night, he noticed his reflection blinking when he didn't. As the rain outside intensified, the mirror fogged up, and words appeared. "Don't turn around." Ignoring the warning, Jacob turned to find his reflection stepping out of the mirror, a malevolent grin on its face. The rain hammered against the windows, drowning out Jacob's final scream. In the ruins of an old estate, Sophie discovered a hidden garden, overgrown but strangely beautiful. Statues of children dotted the area, each eerily lifelike. As Sophie explored, she heard laughter and the rustle of leaves, though no one was there. That night, she dreamed of the statues moving, their faces filled with sorrow. When she returned the next day, a new statue stood in the garden, one that looked exactly like her. The wind whispered through the garden, mingling with the soft patter of rain. A hiker named Ethan ventured into a forest known for its strange whistling sounds. The deeper he went, the louder the whistling grew, as if the trees themselves were singing. As night fell, the melody turned dissonant, and the whistling seemed to follow him. Lost and panicked, Ethan stumbled upon a clearing filled with wooden figures, each whistling the same haunting tune. When he tried to run, the figures turned to face him, their whistles growing louder. The rain outside became a soothing counterpoint to the eerie melody that haunted Ethan's mind. In an old apartment building, one door on the top floor was painted a deep red and had no number. Jenna, a new tenant, heard strange noises from behind it, scratching, murmurs, and faint cries. One night, she found the door slightly ajar. Inside was a room filled with paintings of the building's residents, each face twisted in terror. In the corner stood an unfinished painting of Jenna, the brush still wet. The rain outside fell harder, masking the soft sound of the door creaking shut. At an antique shop, Mark found a clock with no hands, only a single glowing countdown. The shopkeeper warned him not to wind it, but Mark couldn't resist. As the countdown began, strange things happened. Shadows moved on their own, whispers filled the air, and his dreams became nightmares. When the clock reached 0, Mark's reflection disappeared from every mirror, and the clock reset, waiting for its next victim. The rain's rhythm seemed to sync with the ticking of the cursed clock. A long-abandoned train station was said to be haunted by its last conductor. One stormy evening, Lily, a historian, decided to investigate. As lightning illuminated the tracks, an old train pulled in, its windows glowing faintly. The conductor, pale and smiling, invited her aboard. The train sped into darkness, its passengers silent shadows. Days later, Lily's notebook was found on the platform, filled with sketches of the train's ghostly passengers. The sound of distant thunder merged with the soft drizzle, as if the train's ghostly whistle still echoed.